Lebanese Mountain Bread. That's right, as promised, I'm going to show you my take on what has become my favorite flatbread. And possibly, at least for the time being, maybe my favorite bread. Oh, and by the way, if you happen to live on a mountain in Lebanon, and at some point during this video you think to yourself, hey, that's not how we do it. Well, I just wanted to quickly mention, this is how they do it on the other mountain. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with this very simple and sort of pizza-like dough. And we'll begin by dumping a portion of our bread flour into a bowl, followed by a teaspoon of dry active yeast. Or is it active dry yeast? I forget, but same stuff. And then we'll also toss in a little touch of sugar, followed by some warm but not too hot water. Okay, I usually shoot for about 105 degrees, which should basically feel like warm bath water. Although that probably doesn't help much, since I don't think people take baths anymore. I mean, who's got that kind of time? Especially considering all the hours we spend on social media. But anyway, what we'll do at this point is give that a mix to complete what some people in the business would call a sponge. So what we'll do is mix that smooth, and then we'll go ahead and cover it and let it sit for about a half hour to an hour, or until it gets nice and bubbly, and hopefully it looks a little something like this. So that is looking good, and we clearly have a very enthusiastic yeast colony growing. And then once that's been accomplished, we'll go ahead and add the rest of the ingredients, which will include a spoon of olive oil, as well as a little bit of salt. And then last but not least, we'll dump in the rest of our flour. And even though I'm using bread flour here, I'm pretty sure this will work with all purpose. And then what we'll do once all that's together is grab a wooden spoon, and we'll give this a mix. And we will keep mixing until it all pulls together to form a relatively sticky dough ball. Although, don't confuse sticky with wet. Okay, towards the end of this step, that dough ball should pull away from the bowl fairly cleanly, and the texture should be somewhat similar to this. So if yours does seem super wet, and is still sort of smearing against the bowl, you can add a little more flour. But this is looking pretty good. So at this point, I'll go ahead and transfer that to a well-floured surface to give it a little bit of a kneading. And as usual, we're using the bare minimum of flour, just enough to keep it from sticking to our fingers or the work surface. And what we'll do is work that dough for just about 2 minutes until we've formed, and stop me if you've heard this one before, a very soft, very supple, slightly elastic dough. And really all that means is if we press on it, it sort of springs back. So that is looking very nice, if I do say so myself. And once that's set, what we'll do is transfer that into a bowl that we've drizzled in a few drops of olive oil. And we'll kind of roll that dough around to coat it lightly. And that is pretty much it for our dough production. All we have left to do is cover this and leave it in some warm spot for about an hour to an hour and a half, or until it doubles in size. Okay, so the time is going to depend on how warm the spot is. But this is what mine looked like about an hour and 15 minutes later. And at this point, what we'll do is transfer that to our work surface and give it another quick knead to basically knock out all the air. And then once we have our dough successfully degassed, we have a couple options. We could use this right away if we had to, but I do not recommend it. What I suggest is transferring this into some kind of zip-top bag and place it in the fridge overnight before we use it. And I know I probably should have told you before we started that you're not going to be able to eat this till tomorrow, but trust me, you're going to get a better product. Right? Not only are the flavors going to develop, and it's going to be tastier, but the texture is going to be better, and the all-important stretching step is going to be easier. So I did in fact leave mine overnight, at which point it looks something like this. So it might grow a little bit in the fridge, but it's basically sort of going to look the same. But regardless, whether you use yours right away or leave it overnight like I did, the next steps are going to be the same. We're going to pinch off a portion of dough, for me something slightly smaller than a golf ball, and we'll go ahead and sort of rub and press that on the work surface to squeeze out all the air. At which point we'll begin a 2-step formation process. And the first step will be to roll this out to about 1/8 of an inch thick, and again using just enough flour to keep it from sticking. Right, the one thing that most bad breads have in common, too much flour. So please be careful. But having said that, the dough is going to be sticky, so you are going to need some. And like I said, we're going to roll that out to about 1/8 of an inch thick, which sounds kind of thin, but not even close to how thin this needs to be. Which is why when it gets to this point, we're going to stop. And we'll give that a little stretch with our hands. And then, believe it or not, we will lay that over the top of the bottom of a lightly floured mixing bowl. And it's over this dome surface where we're going to stretch this incredibly thin, as in pretty much see-through. So it might take you a few seconds to get it started. But once you do, just keep going around, pulling it down, until basically you've stretched it as thin as humanly possible, without it tearing. And by the way, how this is done back in the old country is the dough is actually stretched over a round pillow, which is then used to flop it on top of the grill they use to cook this. But since you probably don't have a Lebanese Mountain Bread dough pillow, and mine's at the cleaners, We'll go ahead and use this upside down bowl, which works quite nicely as you can see. And I should mention, if this looks a little too tricky, or like too much fun, and you just prefer to roll yours, it will still work. It just won't come out as thin or as good. But anyway, you decide. You are, after all, the Sherlock Holmes of stretching dough on domes. But anyway, what we'll do once our dough is stretched as thin as possible is very carefully with floured fingers, transfer that into a very hot, preheated, dry cast iron skillet. All right, so we're definitely going high heat here. And because of that, and because this dough's so thin, this is only going to take about 45 seconds to a minute per side. And as that first side cooks, you're going to see lots of little bubbles forming, which is exactly what we want to see. And after about a minute, we'll go ahead and flip that over. Oh, and if you're wondering why I'm pushing down on it with a spatula, I'm not sure. You probably don't have to. Sometimes I just like to do things. But anyway, we'll give that side about a minute, and that's it. If your pan was hot enough, you should see some beautiful brown marks on those blisters. And then, very important, what we'll do as these finish is pile them up on top of each other. And then we'll keep those covered with either a towel or another plate. And what's going to happen because of the residual heat? Those are going to kind of gently steam, which is really the official final step of the cooking process. Right? These would still be pretty good if you didn't do that. But if you do, they're going to retain more moisture and be even more supple. So I think that's one of the keys. But anyway, that's it. My relatively simple method for simulating Lebanese mountain bread. And if you've never had this before, you're in for a huge treat. All right, I guess it's sort of like pita bread, but thinner, tastier, stretchier, just better on every level. And as far as I'm concerned, just a vastly superior all-purpose flatbread. Which reminds me, don't feel like you have to make some exotic Middle Eastern food to eat with this. I mean, it's amazing with things as basic and simple as a BLT. Oh, and one quick bonus tip here. You definitely want to season your tomatoes with a little bit of salt and pepper, since that really does make a huge difference. But anyway, let me go ahead and roll this up. And right here I was trying to do the classic shawarma roll, where we kind of fold in the bottom so everything doesn't run out as we eat it. But I overstuffed it, so it didn't work. But I wasn't upset, mostly because I remembered I was just about to eat a BLT on Lebanese Mountain Bread, which really was fantastic. And I am not a big wrap guy. I never order a wrap, because they're usually served on some kind of insipid flour tortilla. Well, this, my friends, is roughly 1,000 times better than that dry, tasteless tortilla. But anyway, just an amazing flatbread, delicious and fun to make. The only slight downside to discovering this stuff is that now I'm significantly less impressed with our pita bread recipe. Sorry, pita bread, but we'll always have hummus. Anyway, kidding aside, I do find this stuff superior to that on almost every level, and I really do hope you give it a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Wool Roll Bread. That's right, I've spun quite a few yarns on this channel, several of which were true. But one thing I've never done is make a bread that looks like a bunch of rolls of wool yarn. And if this looks like it's going to be super hard and complicated, that's good. That's exactly what we want people to think. And it will be our little secret just how simple and easy this technique is. In fact, what you're seeing here is my very first attempt. And not to brag, but I think I nailed it. Or should I say knitted it? But anyway, let's go ahead and get started with our dough, which is going to begin with something called a water roux starter, ROUX, which is nothing more than water and flour that we're going to whisk together and then eventually cook over medium heat until it gets very hot and comes together to eventually form something that looks like a gluey paste. And since I didn't want to stop stirring to change camera angles, I'm going to go ahead and fast forward to the part where it starts to get thick. And it's right about here where you would probably be getting a little bit nervous, since it looks like we're getting a bunch of lumps and it's going to be ruined. But it's not. Just keep whisking over medium, and eventually it will smooth out beautifully. And hopefully, if everything goes according to plan, it will eventually look like this. And that's it after pulling it off the heat. All we have to do is let it cool down completely before we use it. And that's it. Once our water roux is ready, we can move on to the actual dough, which is going to start with some warm milk, over which we will sprinkle some dry active yeast. And then we'll let that stuff bloom, as they say, on the surface for about 10 minutes, before proceeding with the rest of our ingredients, which will include our now fully cooled starter. And yes, if you're having flashbacks to the milk bread recipe, there's a good reason. Since that dough started the same way, only it was a milk-based roux, and the starter worked so amazingly well in that bread, I decided to try it in this. And then we'll also toss in some sugar, as well as some salt, followed by 1 large beaten egg. And then of course we're going to need some flour, and I'm just using all-purpose here, but bread flour would also be perfectly fine. And then last but not least, we'll throw in a few chunks of butter before we start kneading this with our dough hook. And yes, I know sometimes we knead the dough first, until it comes together before we add the butter in. But here, since we're only adding a little bit, I think it's fine to add it right at the beginning. And of course, you know the drill. At the beginning here, don't be afraid to stop the mixer and go ahead and scrape down the sides with a spatula. And what we're eventually trying to achieve here is a dough that's very smooth, a little bit sticky, and fairly elastic, which I'm going to give you a great look at here as I transfer it onto my work surface. Okay, so this is pretty much what we're going for. It kind of wants to stick to our hands on the table, but it doesn't attach itself and it will pull away. And by the way, even at this point, if it seems a little bit too sticky, you can always knead in a little more flour. But once we're happy with it, what we'll do is form it into a nice smooth ball, and then we'll transfer it back into the bowl which we've lightly buttered, at which point we'll cover that and let it rise for about an hour to an hour and a half, or until it just about doubles in size. And as you know, if you poke it with your finger and it springs back, it needs to rise longer. But if it doesn't, and mine didn't, we can go ahead and transfer it onto a work surface. And we'll go ahead and press out all the air and form that into a nice, relatively uniform disc. At which point we'll grab our bench scraper and cut this into 5 equally sized pieces. And yes, 4 would be easier, as would 6, but 6 is too many, and 4 is not enough. So we're doing 5. And then once portioned, what we'll do is roll each of these into a little ball like this. Oh, and I should mention it's kind of important these are equally sized. And to get them exact, what you can do is weigh the ball of dough and then divide by 5, and then portion each one perfectly, which I may or may not have done between shots. But if you can get them close by just eyeing it, that's fine. And that's it. Once we have our 5 little dough balls formed, we'll go ahead and cover those with some plastic, and we'll let those rest on the counter for 15 minutes before all the magic starts to happen. And by magic, I mean making these look like a roll of wool yarn. And for that, what we'll do is take 1 ball of dough, and using just enough flour so it doesn't stick, we'll go ahead and roll that out into sort of an oval shape. Or is that oblong? But anyway, we're trying to get something about 5 to 6 inches wide by about 8 to 9 inches long. At which point we're going to grab our bench scraper, and we're going to start making cuts down through the dough, leaving roughly 1/3 of the dough towards us uncut. And we're basically trying to get these cuts as close as we can together. So I'm not sure exactly how far apart these are, but let's say about 1/8 of an inch. And then what we'll do once we have about 2/3 of that cut into strands is we'll roll that uncut third a little bit and then place over whatever we're going to stuff inside, which in my case is going to be some chunks of dark chocolate. Okay, I think dried fruit is the most popular choice, but what would you rather have, chocolate or dried fruit? Right, that's what I thought. And that's it, we'll go ahead and roll that up, making sure we kind of tuck in the sides to hold everything in. And then once we get to the cut part, we will roll very carefully so as not to press and crush those beautiful strips of dough. And as we finish rolling this, we'll want to try to get our seam on the bottom. And that's it, our first roll of wool is done. And once that's been accomplished, we'll go ahead and pick that up and carefully place that against the side of our prepared springform pan. And by prepared, I mean generously buttered, with a circle of buttered parchment paper in the bottom. And that's it, we just need to do that 4 more times. And if we put those end to end, they should just go around the circumference of our pan. And if your rolls are a little short, it's okay if there's a little gap between them, because when they rise, they will touch. Or on the other hand, if they're a little long, you can just kind of scooch them in there, since as this rises, it's going to look fantastic. And that's it, once all 5 of our wool rolls have been panned, we will cover this with a piece of plastic or kitchen towel, and we'll let it rise in a warm spot for about 45 minutes to an hour, or until those rolls just about double in size. And this is exactly what mine looked like at that point. And then what we'll do before we bake this is brush the tops with a little bit of milk, being very gentle and careful not to deflate the dough. And that's it, once that surface has been lightly brushed, it is now ready to transfer into the center of a 350-degree oven for about 30 to 35 minutes, or until it's beautifully golden brown and looks like this. Check it out, it looks exactly, well, vaguely, like rolls of wool. And then what we'll do is let this sit and cool in the pan for 10 minutes before releasing the latch and removing the ring. And then once that's been accomplished, We will very carefully take a spatula and slide that off the bottom, and then we will let it cool on this rack completely, as in all the way down to room temp, at which point it's ready to plate up, decorate, and serve. So I went ahead and garnished with some beautiful spring blossoms, which I freshly cut from a pear tree in front of our house. And I'm going to go ahead and tear one off and try one out. And sorry, I had to move the flowers, since I thought I saw something moving, and it probably would have been a good idea to rinse that off. But anyway, if you're a fan of things like chocolate croissants, you are probably going to love this. Okay, the combination of a slightly sweet buttery dough with just a little touch of dark chocolate is just a timeless classic. But this would be the perfect time to remind you that this really is just a techniques video, and this will work with just about anything you could think of to put inside. Okay, as I mentioned, dried fruit seems very popular. I've also seen these things filled with jam and things like custard. Or if you're not into the sweet approach, you can go totally savory and use the same filling as like a barbecued pork bun, or the same mixture you'd use in a sausage roll. Or hey, what about wool roll bread, cordon bleu? So as usual, all that will be up to you. I mean, you are after all Mary's little lamb, of whether these get filled with cheese and ham. But really, I think the most important thing to remember is that this looks so cool and so visually impressive, people really aren't going to care too much about what you put in. They are going to love this no matter what, which is why no matter what you decide to use, I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Garlic Naan. That's right, we've posted a lot of flatbreads on the channel, like pita bread, flour tortillas, mountain bread, and I'm sure a few others as well. But I've never done a video for what is probably my favorite flatbread, and that would be garlic naan. So that's what we're attempting to do today. And it can be challenging without the super hot tandoor oven, but I think I've come up with a pretty decent technique for doing these in the home kitchen, as you're going to see relatively soon. But before we get to that, we have to start our dough, which will begin as usual with some very warm but not too hot water, into which we will add a little bit of white sugar, as well as 1 packet of dry active yeast. And what we'll do is just let that sit there for about 10 to 15 minutes to sort of give that yeast a head start, and also to test if it's alive. And what we can do while we're waiting for that is move on to make our garlic butter, which we'll start by melting 1 stick of butter over medium heat in the small pan. And for the record, I'm making way more than I need for this recipe, since there's like 40 other things we can use that for. And what we'll do once that melts is wait for it to sing before we add our garlic. And what I mean by sing is that we're waiting for this sound. All right, you hear that? And once our butter starts doing that, we'll go ahead and stir in our garlic. And a lot of it. That was like 4 giant cloves. And we will quickly mix that in and immediately turn off the heat. All right, very important, we really don't want to cook the garlic too much. So basically, as soon as we add it and stir it in, we're going to turn off our heat. And we could just leave that on the stove until we're ready to use it. So our garlic butter is set, and we could head back to check out our yeast, which as you can see was most certainly alive. And I can tell because it looks like the head of a beer. And that's our signal it's okay to go ahead and add the rest of the ingredients, which will include a spoon of plain yogurt, as well as some bread flour, although I'm pretty sure you can use all-purpose for this. We will also toss in some salt. And then last but not least, 1 tablespoon of our freshly made garlic-infused butter. And once all that's in there, we'll take a wooden spoon and start mixing. And we will keep mixing until we form what we call in the business a shaggy dough, which is going to look a little something like this. And then what we'll do once we've reached our shaggy dough stage is switch to our hand. And we'll get in there and we'll start pressing and pushing everything together until eventually we can sort of start kneading. And we'll keep doing that until basically everything's been pulled off the sides of the bowl, and we've sort of formed a rough ball of dough. And it might seem obvious, but I'll tell you anyway. If things seem too dry and it's not coming together, just add a little touch of water. Or if it's too wet and sticky to come together, just add a little more flour. Okay, that is just you cooking. But anyway, once it does come together like this, we'll go ahead and transfer that onto our table. And we will need that for about 3 or 4 minutes until we have a fairly smooth, fairly elastic dough. And if you have to dust it with a little bit of flour, go ahead. But because of that little bit of garlic butter we added, it shouldn't really stick to the table too much. So we'll go ahead and keep kneading that as shown, until, like I said, we have something that's fairly smooth, and it sort of springs back to the touch. So that is looking pretty good right there. And once that's been accomplished, we will transfer that into a bowl. And then we'll drizzle over a little more of our garlic butter, so we can coat our dough so it won't dry out while it rises. And of course you could use a little bit of oil like we usually do, but that butter was right there. And then what we'll do once that's set is cover it and let it sit for about an hour to 2 hours, or until it doubles in size. And generally doughs that have some fat in them, like this one, will take a little bit longer to rise. So don't panic if this takes a little longer than you're used to. And after about 2 hours, mine looked like this. And then as usual, we'll go ahead and punch that down and transfer it onto our table, where we are quickly going to press it into some kind of rectangular shape. Or, by the way, any semi-regular shape. Because the only reason we're doing this is to make it easier to cut into 6 pieces with our bench scraper. And theoretically, if our dough's a nice even size, we should be able to cut our 6 portions into pretty even sizes. But of course, having said that, as you can see, mine were not that even. Which is fine because this is naan. And you do not want to trust a pile of naan bread that's all exactly the same size. All right, we don't want this looking like it came out of a machine, which is clearly not going to be an issue here. But anyway, once those are cut, we will use a cupped hand to sort of rub those on the table in a circular motion so that we end up with 6 mini dough balls. And once that's done, we'll go ahead and lightly dust those with flour. And then what we'll do is cover those with some plastic wrap. And we will let them sit there for about 15 to 20 minutes to proof, which is just a fancy baking word for a brief second rising. And after about 15 or 20 minutes, this is what mine look like. So yes, in that short amount of time, they will puff up a fair amount. And that's it. Once these are proofed, we can start rolling those out on a very lightly floured surface. And I generally shoot for about 1/8 of an inch thick. And by the way, feel free to make these round if you want, but I believe traditionally these do have more of an oval shape. And besides, an oval is easier than a circle. But either way, like I said, we'll roll that out to about 1/8 of an inch. At which point I'm going to do one optional step. And that would be to press and or roll a little bit of freshly chopped cilantro onto one side. And for once, my cilantro was nice and dry and easy to use, which made it a little bit harder to stick. But that's okay, just press it or roll it on the best you can. And again, this is optional, so skip it if you want. I mean, you are, after all, the Chef John of your garlic naan. But I think it looks cool and provides more flavor, so I do it. And that's it. Once our naan has been rolled and herbed, we will head to the stove, where we will place that in an insanely hot cast iron skillet. Okay, so preheat that on high, and then once you think it's hot enough, wait another 5 minutes, and then it's probably ready. And you'll see as soon as you put that in, bubbles are going to start forming on the surface. Okay, probably lots of little ones, and then a few random big ones. And those bubbles are kind of key, because what's going to happen after a couple minutes is we're going to flip this, and we'll give it a gentle pressing with our spatula. And ideally, when we flip this back over, wherever those larger bubbles were, there's going to be a perfect char mark from the pan. So we will flip that over and give the second side a couple minutes. At which point, if everything's gone according to plan, we should have something that looks like this. And the whole key here is make sure the pan was smoking hot. And then what we'll do to finish this, as soon as we remove it from the pan, is go ahead and brush that on both sides with our warm garlic butter. Plus, if you want, you can spoon on some of that chopped garlic. And if you want, some people like to sprinkle over a little coarse salt here, so suit yourself. Oh, and by the way, if it looks like I'm putting too much garlic butter on this, I'm not. That's just a light playing tricks with your eyes. Plus, as this sits, most of that will soak in. Although I'm not going to give this one time to, since I'm going in for the official taste right now. And hopefully what we've achieved here is something that's kind of chewy but still tender, with a little bit of random crispiness here and there from those charred blisters. Plus, above and beyond the aforementioned amazing texture, we're talking about a substantial amount of buttery, garlicky goodness. So yes, maybe the world's best garlic bread is not actually garlic bread. It might be garlic naan. And of course, as you're finishing one of these, you really should be singing, na 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 na, na 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 na, hey, goodbye. But anyway, after I ate that one, I went ahead and did the rest. And like every flatbread, pancake, and crepe, the last couple you do will always be better than the first few, which is probably because the dough's rested longer, but also because your pan's probably getting hotter. Plus, you've had a few to practice on. And that's it. Once we've cooked them all and piled them up, maybe we'll finish with a little more cilantro. And that, my friends, is one handsome plate of garlic naan. And as amazing as that one I ate all by itself was, you put this next to some spicy curry, like for example this creamy cashew chicken curry that I'm probably going to show you very soon, and you're going to take this experience up to a whole other level, as in like off the charts delicious. I mean, if there's a better combination than a rich, creamy, aromatic chicken curry paired with a crispy, chewy, buttery garlic naan, I would really like to know what that is. But anyway, that's it. My take on a home version of garlic naan. There's only one appropriate way I can think to end this video. Na 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 na. Actually, I'm not going to sing again. And I'll finish by simply saying I really do hope you give this a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with No-Knead Country Bread. That's right, this delicious and gorgeous loaf is part bread recipe, part science experiment, and part fun family project when you're all stuck in the house together looking for things to do. And while this procedure is very simple, it does take about 24 hours to do start to finish. So if you want this today, make sure you start it yesterday. And what we'll want to do first is add some flour to a large mixing bowl. And I'm going to be using two kinds. Okay, I'm going to start with some bread flour, although regular all-purpose flour will work. And then I'm also going to add a little bit of whole wheat flour, which in my case is going to be some sprouted spelt flour, which is by far my favorite whole grain flour to bake with. And then to our flours we will add a little bit of dry active yeast. And I mean a little bit. Okay, a no-knead bread recipe only needs about a quarter teaspoon of yeast. And since apparently there's a big yeast shortage going on, that is some good news. And then what we'll do is give that a quick stir with a wooden spoon before we stir in 2 cups of cold water. And I know we usually use warm water when we make bread, but with this, because we're going to let it rise for such a long time, some cold fresh water from the tap actually works out better. And what we want to do here is stir this with the wooden spoon for about 3 minutes until a very wet, extremely sticky dough forms. And then once that's been accomplished, we'll go ahead and add the last ingredient, which will be some kosher salt, or sea salt, or any salt that doesn't have any additives. And that's it. We'll go ahead and give that another stir for another 2 minutes or so, at which point, believe it or not, our dough will be done. And by the way, there's actually 2 reasons we don't have to knead this. First of all, we can't. Right? This is way too wet and sticky to work with our hands. And then secondly, we don't have to rely on kneading to build gluten, because when you let a dough ferment and rise for a very long time, it actually develops gluten all on its own, which is nice. But anyway, what we'll do once our salt's been mixed in is simply wrap this in foil and let it sit out at room temp for about 18 hours. All right, give or take. Which is why I generally like to start this in the afternoon sometime, so we can bake it up sometime in the afternoon the next day. So like I said, we'll go ahead and cover that and let it sit for 18 hours. At which point, if everything's gone according to plan, it should look something like this. Oh yeah, that is looking good, and very bubbly, but more like a scientific experiment than a bread dough. But that's okay, because just watch. And at this point, we'll go ahead and take a spatula, and we will deflate this by scraping down the sides, after which we'll kind of slide our spatula underneath and fold the dough over the top of itself like this. Okay, sort of turning the bowl like this as we go. And besides deflating and degassing the dough, we're also giving all that gluten that developed a nice stretch. And that's it. Once we've done that about a dozen times or so, we will go ahead and scrape this extremely soft and sticky dough onto a well-floured surface. Okay, be very generous with the flour. And we will also want to sprinkle some over the top. And it might look like we have a little too much on the table, but we're going to use a lot of that on our hands as we do the next step, which is somehow, some way, form this into a loaf shape. And initially we're just sort of slapping it back and forth, trying to get it to release from the table. And then once it does, we'll use a combination of rolling and folding and turning and tucking until we have the dough formed into some kind of uniform shape. And while you're doing this, make sure you keep your hands well floured. And by the way, the shape does not matter. Right? It could be round, it could be oval. But what does matter is that you end up with a nice smooth skin over the surface. And really, once you achieve that, you should just stop. Which is not easy, because this feels really, really good. Right? You'll see. And then what we'll do once we are happy with our shape and we have a nice smooth surface is transfer this onto a Silpat line baking sheet. Or if you don't have one of those, you could sprinkle down a whole bunch of cornmeal. And once our dough is panned up, we can do a little fine tuning. But not too much. All right? We want to make sure this looks homemade. And in fact, that's why we call it country bread. so that it doesn't really matter what it looks like. Okay, us country folks just want to eat some bread. We're not trying to impress anyone with a perfect loaf. That's what French bakeries in the city are for. But anyway, once we've formed our loaf and it's on a pan, what we'll do is let this rest somewhere uncovered for 2 hours, or until it doubles in size. And personally, my favorite spot would be inside a turned-off oven. But no matter where you leave yours, about 2 hours later it should look something like this. And it will have approximately doubled in size. Although because our dough is so wet, most of that's going to happen outward as opposed to upward. And then at this point we will do 2 things, one of which is optional. We will preheat our oven to 450, and then if we want, we will make 1 slash down the center with a very, very, very sharp knife or a razor. And sometimes I do this and sometimes I don't. It depends on my mood. So I'll let you decide. I mean, you are, after all, the Steve Nash of whether to slash. Man, I miss basketball. And by the way, the main reason for the slash is simply to prevent random ruptures in the crust and other spots. Right, so it's really just an appearance thing. And then before this goes in the oven, if you have a spray bottle, I like to give the dough a light misting with water, which is going to help it develop an even more beautiful crust. But that is also optional, and it's going to look great even if we don't do this. And that's it. Our pan is now ready to transfer into the center of a 450-degree oven for about 30 minutes, or until beautifully browned and looking like this. Oh yeah, that does look like it came from some artisan bakery. But it didn't. You made that. And you can always test this with a thermometer, but the old school way to tell if this is done is by giving it the old tap-a-tap. And if it sounds like that, it's probably done. All right, it will have a nice hollow sound. And that's it. All we have to do is transfer that onto a rack to cool, and cool completely. Okay, if you slice into really hot bread, you're going to lose moisture and it's going to dry out. Although off the record, if it's still a little bit warm, you can probably get away with it. And fair warning, as this cools, it's going to contract, and it's going to get bumpy. But that's okay because those bumps are from bubbles, and it's the bubbles that make the bread. As you'll see here as I slice in. And that was looking just about perfect. In fact, let me go to a tighter shot so you can see. And even though it takes many, many hours, by using this no-knead method with such a wet dough, the texture you're going to get here is just incredible. Okay, that outside is going to feature the perfect amount of crustiness, and the inside will be wonderfully light, with just the right amount of chewiness. And yes, spreading on some butter is highly recommended. So I finished that end piece and cut another slice. And of course, you're not supposed to slice on your marble slab with your nice serrated knife. But since the bread is the same color as my wooden cutting board, it just doesn't look as good. So I took one for the team. And not only does this super easy no-knead technique produce a great texture, but in general, breads that have a long fermentation time always seem to have a better flavor. Oh, and I should mention, if this looks familiar, give or take a little bit of olive oil and a slightly different technique, this is pretty much the same as our ciabatta bread. In fact, if you shape this into a rectangle, that's what you can call it. But anyway, for a little bit of dessert, I'm going to spread some jam on this last piece. And as I ate that, I couldn't help but wonder about all the people that have no idea just how simple it is to make bread. I mean, it's just mixing up some water and flour with a little bit of yeast and a touch of salt. And then a day later, with a very small amount of effort, you have this. Which is why I really do hope you give this a try soon. And also, share this with those people I was just referring to. So please follow the links below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy. Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with how to make your own sandwich rolls. That's right, during our recent and what the critics are calling groundbreaking banh mi video, I promised to show you how to make your very own homemade French rolls, or as they're more generically called, sandwich rolls, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. And while these rolls won't be nearly as expensive as the ones from the store, or contain all those additives and preservatives, I still think you're really going to enjoy these, and as you're about to see, they are very, very easy to make. So let's go ahead and get started with the dough. And to do that, we'll toss a package of dry active yeast into the bowl of our stand mixer. And to that, we will add our warm water, and we'll give that a mix. And then usually we wait about 10 minutes to see if the yeast is active. But this time I didn't do that. The yeast was brand new, plus I was feeling kind of lucky. So I proceeded to the last 2 ingredients, some bread flour, and sure, you can use all-purpose here. I mean, it is after all called all-purpose. But if you have it, I do prefer the texture using bread flour here. And then last but not least, we'll toss in some salt, and that's it. And at this point, what we'll do is grab our dough hook, and head over to the stand mixer, where we will knead this all together for about 5 minutes until we have a nice, smooth, soft, slightly but not too sticky dough. And if everything's gone according to plan, it should look something like this. And one clue that you did good, see how the dough pulls away clean from the sides of the bowl, as well as that dough hook? That generally means you have just enough flour. All right, so if it seems like it's still a little bit wet, and it's still kind of smearing or sticking to the bowl, just toss in a little more flour. But mine was looking just about right. And assuming you've achieved something very similar, what we'll do next is kind of form this into a smooth ball, and we'll transfer that back into our bowl. And then, as usual, we'll add just a few drops of vegetable oil and rub that all over our dough ball, as well as the inside of the bowl, which theoretically prevents the dough from drying out during the rising, which is the next step. So let's go ahead and cover that and transfer it to some warm, draft-free place for about an hour to an hour and a half, or until it doubles in size. And as usual, I just used the inside of my turned-off oven. And assuming our yeast was as active as we suspected, about an hour to an hour and a half later, your dough should look like this. And then what we do at this point is poke it with our fingers to deflate it, which is a lot of fun but completely unnecessary, since we're also going to transfer this to a lightly floured work surface and kind of press it down into some sort of rectangle shape. So what we're doing here would have deflated that dough anyway. But having said that, one of the great joys of making your own bread dough is poking it with your fingers after it's risen. So enjoy yourself. But anyway, like I said, we're going to press that down into some kind of uniform shape, which is hopefully going to make it a little easier to divide this into equal portions. So I'm going to cut mine in half, and then each half into 3 to make 6 rolls. And by the way, pro tip, if you have a digital scale, you could weigh all your dough in grams, and then divide by 6, and then use that number to portion your dough exactly. So once baked, each roll would be pretty much exactly the same size. So if you're into perfection, that's one way you can do it. Or you can just eye it like I usually do. But anyway, we'll divide that up into 6 equal portions, and then by using our cupped hand in a circular motion, we will roll those into 6 dough balls, as smooth and as uniform as we can get them. And then what we want to do at this point is cover these with a clean, dry cloth and let them rest 15 minutes before we try to shape our rolls. So we will fast forward about 15 minutes, at which point our dough should look like this. So those will have risen just a little bit, but we mostly did that to let the dough relax. And then what we're going to do at this point is take one of those balls and press it out into sort of an oval rectangle. There's probably a name for an oval rectangle, but I'm not sure what it is. But anyway, we'll flatten that out with our fingertips until we have something about 6 or 7 inches wide, and then we'll simply roll it up nice and tight like this. And no need to be concerned about the seam. That's going to pretty much disappear as we roll this. And if not, we'll make sure that ends up on the bottom. And then what we'll do to finish these off is kind of taper the tips. And how we'll do that is by angling our hands at about a 45-degree angle, and by applying a little extra pressure as we roll from the center out, you should fairly easily form some nice pointy tips, which for me gives these French-style sandwich rolls their signature shape. So like pretty much everything else in life, that is optional, but it only takes a couple seconds, and is very easy, so why wouldn't you do it? But regardless, once those are shaped, we can transfer those onto a parchment-lined baking sheet. And we don't want to crowd those, so I'm going to do 2 pans of 3. And once those are panned up, they're ready for the final rise. So we'll cover those with some clean, dry towels and let those sit for about an hour or until they're doubled in size. At which point, hopefully, they look something like this. And then before we pop these in the oven, we have to do 2 very important things. The first of which would be to cut a slash down the length with a very, very sharp knife. And despite the weird stain near the top, I like to use this knife that was Michelle's great-grandfather's because it's long, thin, and extremely sharp. But I should mention, an old-fashioned razor blade will do the same thing. And we want to go in at about a 45-degree angle, about a 1/4 inch deep, somewhere between the side and the top. So that first one I did was a little too far down towards the side, so those last 2 were a little better. And please note, these are not just for decoration, although that's part of it. But that slice is going to allow that crust to kind of expand as these bake, which really is an important factor for giving them the proper texture. And then besides lacerating the dough, the other thing we need to do before these go in the oven is spritz them with a little bit of water. Okay, we just want some plain water in a spray bottle, and we will give those a misting all over, which is going to help form our crust. And then once our rolls have been properly spritzed, we can go ahead and transfer those into the center of a 450-degree oven for about 20 minutes. And no, you weren't seeing things. There was a pan of water on the bottom of the oven. And that's there for the same reason we sprayed our bread before we put it in. That moisture in the oven helps develop the crust. And then what we'll do about halfway through the cooking time, we'll open the oven and give those a turn, as well as 1 more spray of water. So let's go ahead and rotate those pans, which hopefully you'll accomplish much faster than I did. I am surprisingly uncoordinated. But anyway, we'll give those a turn, and then 1 more spray of water, which I almost forgot, but I didn't. So we will give those one more spritz, and we will push those back in and let those bake for another 10 minutes or so, or until you're looking at a couple pans of the most beautiful sandwich rolls you've ever seen, which is what I have right here. And at this point, we're almost done. All we need to do now is transfer these to a rack and let them cool completely before we try to cut them or tear them open. Or if you cut these while they're still piping hot, you're going to lose a lot of moisture. So please let these cool all the way down to room temp before you try to cut into them. Or in my case, tear into them. And that right there, my friends, I think is the perfect sandwich roll. We have that gorgeous, thin, chewy crust surrounding what is a beautifully light and airy inside. For me, just the perfect combination for any kind of sandwich work. And please keep in mind, this is a techniques video. And even though I showed you a dough at the beginning, you really can make these with any bread recipe you want. I mean, you guys are the Dr. Scholl's of your sandwich rolls. And speaking of feet, that reminds me, our ciabatta bread, which means slipper bread, would probably work really nicely here. But anyway, that's it. No matter which dough you use, or what kind of sandwich you make, from the exotic banh mi to your common, everyday, run-of-the-mill tuna sub, I really do hope you give these a try soon. So head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.